Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching What is Terminal Services, or How to Run Applications by Remote Control, more or less. Let's talk about what's going to be in this video. We're going to talk about Hank's question, just what in the Sam Hill is this? And then we're going to talk about the different components of terminal services. Once we kind of get a brief idea of what's happening with TS, then we're going to go ahead and get it installed, and I'll talk you through more details about terminal services while we're actually doing the installation too. So let's go ahead and talk about what Hank's question is here. Hank has purchased a report building software, and it's based upon Microsoft Office components. Now this is going to be made available to traveling salespeople. But the issue is that this report building software is going to be handling sensitive data on client accounts. So, having traveling salespeople have unsecured access, this is a really bad idea. So what you do is you suggest actually creating a terminal services option to increase security for the application. And of course, Hank's response is, now just what in the Sam Hill is this terminal services thing anyhow? And, well, you need to show him. So really, terminal services kind of operates on really an older model, if you want to think about it as such, but it's obviously been updated for a lot more robust ability. Here's the deal. Terminal services really operates on the idea of having smaller clients, or kind of terminals, if you will, access a server. Now, here's the deal. The server actually does all the hard work. So the application actually lives on the server. The server does all of the processing, all of the grunt work, but the application is actually controlled and accessed on the clients and other clients too. So really, we kind of are looking at more of a Citrix kind of set of applications, or really, if you want to even go back to the idea of the old mainframes, if you're familiar with those. Now, obviously, with terminal services, especially the new updates, we have a lot of very, very cool features with this. It's a lot more robust than those old green terminals that we used to see back in the old days. So with terminal services, when we're actually using the client, we actually get to have a better experience of using the application. It's like the application is actually installed on our machine. It can operate and feel like a regular desktop application, but all the work, remember, is done over here on the server. So really, all that you're really seeing here on the client is the interface, and that's really it. Now, there's a lot of terminal services style products out there, Citrix and several other smaller competitors, but it seems like we're trying to go back to the older model of the old mainframes, where we have dumb terminals doing the accessing, but then we don't need as much hardware on the desktop, so we can actually reduce some hardware expenses for the desktop boxes for our users. Now, I have to tell you that there's going to be applications that are not going to necessarily work well with this. Right? There's a lot, and you'll probably find that most applications will probably play relatively nice, but some just are not going to play well with terminal services. So in our situation, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking our TS1 box, we're going to be installing Microsoft Office, and we're going to be accessing Microsoft Office from a client, but we're actually going to be doing all of the processing work for the Office application on the server. Okay? So really, it's really a great big remote control kind of situation, really. Alright, so let's talk about what makes up terminal services. Okay, well, first of all, we have a server role for TS, no big surprise here. Then we have TS Remote App, which is something you're going to be using probably the most often. And basically, this is a role service that gets installed with the terminal services server role, and allows you to make applications available that live on the server. It makes them available by use by client machines via a shortcut or through another role service called TS Web Access. So basically, we install the application on the server, and then we make it available to desktop users. Alright, now let's talk about the TS licensing role service. Basically, terminal services is going to require you to have more licenses. Now, I know that's probably not the best news in the world, but that's the way it is, okay? And if you have a huge amount of terminal services users out there, the TS licensing role service is actually going to help you manage those licenses much more easily. Now, this might be optional if you only have, if you got 2 or 3 users that are going to be using terminal services, this is probably not going to be necessary for you. But, if you have 250 users using terminal services, TS licensing is going to help you manage those licensed users a little more easily. TS Session Broker. Now, this is a role service that you only want to install if you have multiple terminal services servers operating in a farm or a cluster for highly available applications. So if you have a critical line of business application that's maybe running across 4 or 5 servers, this is a role that you're going to want to have. And basically what it allows you to do is allows clients to reconnect to disconnected sessions and manage connections in a more efficient fashion. If you only have one terminal services server, however, you don't need this, okay? So I just want to let you know that, if that's the case, if you only have one server, I suppose you could install this, but it's not really going to be necessary for you, okay? Now, TS Web Access. This is one of my favorite ways to distribute these. I think this is way cool because it allows you to access TS Remote apps through a web page. Now, users know how to get to stuff using a web page, so it makes it really easy for them to access your particular application. Now, of course, you can also create shortcuts, by the way, but TS Web Access is just a little more convenient way. You tell your users, okay, hey, go to this web page, click on the button that says Microsoft Office or whatever it is. So this is really cool. I'll show you how it works in a little bit. And then TS Gateway. Now, TS Gateway basically allows you to provide terminal services to users outside of your network, and you don't necessarily need to have a VPN running. Now, this is kind of a big deal because in some instances VPNs can be kind of a pain in the neck. But with TS Gateway, we can actually access terminal services applications using just a web connection. All right, so we'll talk more about this one in a different video actually, and we'll talk a little bit more about its concepts later on. But this is basically what terminal services looks like in Server 2008 in terms of the components. Now, let's go ahead and let's turn around and get this installed, and I'll talk to you more about the different components once we get in here. But, basically the role installation, it's pretty easy, but there are some options that you're going to need to know something about as you go to install it. Right? First of all, like what kind of role services are you going to need? And you'll see these right over here in the screen capture. It's always a good idea to know what you actually need to install by understanding what those components are, right? How are you going to use authentication with terminal services? How will your licensing be handled? That's something you're going to have to talk to your accountant about in terms of, how many licenses are you going to be able to buy? Are you going to be able to buy any at all? So that's a question that's going to need to be answered before you start, just jumping in and installing and implementing terminal services. And finally, probably the most important question right here, who's going to actually need access to your terminal services server? One of the options that we're going to see in the role installation wizard is that of actually allowing a particular set of users to have access to the terminal services role. Now, you can actually allow access to users in your Active Directory or in groups, and I'm going to suggest that you're probably going to want to have groups specifically for terminal services users. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and let's jump in. I'm going to bounce this on over to the server here real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and start the role installation service. And by the way, this is definitely going to require us to do a restart of the server. Now, before we jump over to the server, I want to let you know that I have already pre-configured a server named TS1, and I've done this the basics. I've given it a static IP address, I've renamed the machine, joined it to the domain, set the time and date, real basic stuff, but I have not installed any roles. Okay, all we've really done to this particular server you're going to be seeing next is the basic initial configuration task list. Okay, let's bounce over there and let's take a look at the server. Let's get this guy installed. Alright, so here we are over on the terminal services, which I have named TS1, as you see here in the Hyper-V/remote desktop window. Just want to show you real quickly what I've done. I have switched the time zone to Eastern Time for New York, made the static IP address 192.168.5.16. I have renamed the machine TS1, globalmatics.com, and then the domain, of course, I've joined it to the domain, and pretty much nothing else. I did the update thing, and then also I have not added any roles or features. Heck, I haven't even enabled remote desktop because I'm actually remote desktoped here on the Hyper-V machine, right? All right, so that's all I've done to this machine. I haven't done anything. Let's go ahead and close out the ICT here now. Let's get into the server manager. And what we're going to do is we're going to get into installing the TS role. And as you know, I mean, roles are not that complex, really. I mean, there are some options on this one that we do have to know something about. But let's go ahead and click on the roles section. You see 0 of 17 installed. Let's go ahead and add roles here. Now, before I begin, next, let's go ahead and let's put a check mark in Terminal Services here. And we'll tell it next. Introduction to Terminal Services. Yeah. That's all stuff I've told you. Okay, here we go. What role services are we going to be installing for this particular role? So we definitely need Terminal Server, right? You can't get away with without actually installing that. Now, licensing, I'm not going to install that just yet. I can install it later on, though. Session Broker, you know what? Right now, all I'm doing is one TS server, so I don't need Session Broker either. Now, TS Gateway, this is something that I may or may not need. Hank might be thinking of a VPN. We might go ahead and install it anyway. And you see, as soon as I click on TS Gateway, a whole bunch of other stuff needs to also be installed. I do want to point out to you, the web server becomes important in this particular role service. Because if you're going to be accessing terminal services over the internet from the outside world, web server is going to be necessary. Network policy and access services, remote procedure call over HTTP proxy, Windows process activation service, process models, and configuration APIs. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in here that's going to be required for TS Gateway. Now again, remember that if you're using TS Gateway, you will not necessarily need to have a VPN. You can actually access it over the web. So it's kind of a cool thing, especially if you're going to have a lot of traveling salespeople. Now I think that we are with Hank's initial plan for using his new software that's going to be using Microsoft Office services as well. So TS Gateway, we're going to go ahead and install that here. And I like web access. I just think that it's cool. So we're going to go ahead and install that too. And I'll show you how to enable that later on in this video series. So really we're installing everything except for TS licensing, which remember, that's going to manage the client access licenses. And we haven't really talked to Hank about how many users we're going to have yet. I mean, we might have 5 users, and if so, if I have 5 users, I'm not going to install this. I only have 1 server, so TS Session Broker, not necessary for me. All right, I'm going to go ahead and tell it next. And now it's going to tell me it is recommended that you install a terminal server before you install any applications you want to make available to users. If you install a terminal server on a computer that already has applications installed, some of the existing applications may not work correctly in a multiple user environment. Uninstalling then reinstalling the affected applications may resolve these issues. Alright, not a problem, because this is a brand new clean server. We really haven't done anything else with it. So we're okay here. Some applications may require minor setup modifications. Oh, hey, looky here. Minor setup modifications. That's kind of a big deal there. Alright, remember how I was telling you that some applications just will not work with terminal server? They might need some minor setup modifications, quote unquote, or they might not just work at all. Alright, let's just get real, especially if it's an older app, okay? Alright, we'll go ahead and tell it next. Now remember how I was telling you we need to understand before we install this, are we going to plan for authentication? Are we going to make sure that people absolutely have to be logged into our system in order to do this? So let's take a look at this. Network level authentication is a new authentication method that enhances security by providing user authentication earlier in the connection process when a client connects to a terminal server. With network level authentication, user authentication occurs before a full remote desktop connection to the terminal server is established. This is kind of an interesting thing. What we're going to be seeing with terminal services, especially with remote applications like what we're going to be using in this particular video series, we're actually going to be seeing a small remote desktop window. It's kind of a cool thing. So even if you don't realize you're using remote desktop technology, you actually are, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and let's require network level authentication. Only computers that are running both a version of Windows and a version of remote desktop connection client that supports network level authentication can connect to this terminal server. If you're remotely connected to the server, ensure that your computer supports network level authentication to enable reconnection to the server as well. Okay. Or we could, if we have a bunch of older operating systems out there, we could specify do not require network level authentication. No. Remember how we were talking about how our application that we're going to be using remotely is actually going to be handling sensitive user data. Okay, well in that case, this is a big fat no here, okay? All right, we want as much security as we can get into this mix. Let's tell it next. Okay, let's talk about licensing now just a little bit. Now, this is one of those things you're going to have to call up Microsoft or your Microsoft representative, and you're going to have to buy some licenses for this, okay? Now, if you decide that you want to do this later, you actually get 120 days to use this more or less for free without licensing. So this is something that we can worry about and wrestle later. But let's take a look at this per device, okay? A TS per device client access license, or a CAL, must be available for each device that connects to this terminal server. So let's say that we have 5 mobile sales users that are going to be using this particular terminal services server. Well, then we need to buy 5 licenses, one for each of their machines, okay? And that's if those particular users have company issued laptops that they're going to be using for this particular application. Now, let's say that they're going to be accessing it anywhere they may be, all right? Well, we could also purchase a per user client access license for each user that connects to this terminal server. So if you have 5 laptops that have been issued to 5 employees, you're going to use this option. If you have 5 users that are going to be accessing the server, and you don't care whether they're accessing it from their laptop or from their desktop or wherever they may be in the universe, then we can use the per user option. Now look down here, the licensing mode you specify must match the TS CALs that are available for your terminal services license server. So you have to select the option here, and can you switch them? Yes, you can. But you need to make sure that whenever you are buying licenses from Microsoft, that your settings in your terminal server match the licenses that you buy, okay? All right, big fat duh, right? Okay, so here we are now. We get to add the users or users groups that can connect to this terminal server. These users and user groups will be added to the local remote desktop users group, all right? This is a big deal here because you need to understand that those users are also going to be able to access remote desktop, okay? So something to keep in mind. The administrators group is added by default and cannot be removed. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to add in the sales users group, okay? And this is kind of a no-brainer. We just click on add. And now we're going to go ahead, we'll just put in our sales users. Let's check the name here real quick just to make sure. All right, we're good for that. And again, we could put in anybody we want here, a group, an individual user, whatever it may be. But since I'm such a big fan of organizing my users into groups for quick and easy additional access to things like this, I'm a big fan of doing that. So we'll tell it next. Okay, now here we go. When communicating with clients, TS Gateway uses secure sockets layer. Okay, well, you know what? We do have a certificate that's available over on the SharePoint server, but we don't really have a certificate authority running right now. Now, this is what we really should do if we're going to be using this in a production scenario. We should get a certificate from either a third-party source or from a certificate authority running inside of our network. And we could go ahead and click on import, grab a certificate. But if we notice here, the subject name of the certificate match the host name of this server. So one of the big things that I want you to remember, that if you are going to be putting TS Gateway, which is what we're configuring here, into production, make sure you get a certificate that is actually for this TS server and that it matches the host name of the server. All right, you know what we're going to do is we're going to create a self-signed certificate for SSL encryption for this one. Now notice here, this option is recommended for small scale deployments or test scenarios only. Well, that's kind of what we're doing. We really don't know the scope of what Hank has planned for this just yet. And so what we need to do is we need to show him that this actually does work first, right? So we're going to go ahead and we'll use that self-signed certificate. Now remember what we saw with the SSL video for IIS. If you use a self-signed certificate, you're going to get that error unless you have that certificate installed on that particular machine's client browser software. Okay, so if you're going to be using this one, we're probably going to need to reconfigure the traveling salespeople's laptops to actually install that certificate and to trust our server. All right. Okay. Now we could also choose a certificate for SSL encryption later, so we could do that here as well. But you'll notice here that this option is recommended if you plan to request a certificate from a CA and import it later. Okay, well, that's cool, but it also tells you that for TS Gateway to function, you must configure the server with a valid certificate. So if we're going to have users running out around the world accessing this particular terminal server from the internet, then we absolutely have to have a certificate for SSL installed. You cannot use it any other way. Okay. One of the things that Microsoft really prides itself with Server 2008 is that it is pretty much secure out of the box. And this is one of those things that if you want this thing to work at all, you have to use SSL. All right, let's tell it next. All right, now a terminal services connection authorization policy allows you to specify the users who can connect to this TS gateway. And it's going to tell us that you can use this wizard to create both authorization policies. We need terminal services connection authorization policy. Okay, that allows users to connect to it, but you also need a resource authorization policy as well, a TS-RAP, that will allow you to configure a mapping between user groups and the computers they can connect to remotely through TS Gateway. So we can go ahead and we can use this wizard to create both of those now, and I think that we'll go ahead and we'll just do it now, because we know that we only want the sales users to actually have access to this. And for the time being, unless Hank tells us differently, we're going to go ahead and give access to all of our sales users for this particular terminal services gateway option. All right, we'll tell it next. All right, so now we need to create a connection authorization policy to allow users to connect to this TS gateway server. So specify at least one supported Windows authentication method. Well, passwords, that's good. And this is just going to authenticate them against Active Directory, just so you know. But if you're also going to require users to have smart cards, well, that's something you're going to have to contend with as well. But it's an option, okay? So if you really want to lock down access to the particular applications on the server, smart cards are a good way to go, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and we'll tell it next. Now we need to create a wrap policy here to specify the network resources that users are allowed to connect to. Okay, so what are we going to do? For the time being, we're going to leave the name as it is, as the default. That's fine. Now we can basically specify which computers that the users are going to be allowed to access, allow users to connect only to computers in the following group. Let's click on Browse here. Now, at this stage in the game, we would actually need to go back to our Active Directory users and computer snap-in and add in TS1 into a particular group if we want to utilize this. For the time being, by the way, we can switch this later, but for the time being, we're going to allow users to connect to any computer on the network. This option allows users to connect to any computer they can access through remote desktop. So for the time being, we'll do that, but we may come back later on and actually specify which group of computers, i.e. TS1, would need to belong to in order for this to be a little more secure. But for the time being, we'll go ahead and we'll use this for functionality. And now what we need to do is we need to get into network policy and access services. All right, so man, we got a whole bunch of stuff in here that we are having to configure. All right, so what we're going to do is we'll tell it next. Now notice here that network policy services is selected by default. Okay. Now with network policy server, we can also deploy a network access protection or a NAP policy for client health. So as our users are running around out there with their laptops all over the world trying to sell stuff, when they connect back into the network using the terminal services gateway option, then we can get very specific about how and why they get to connect. Things like making sure the antivirus is updated, making sure that they have all of the recommended updates from Microsoft, and all that kind of good stuff. And by the way, this kind of stuff is really outside of the scope of this particular course, but I just want to kind of talk about this briefly. Routing remote access services allows remote users to access resources on your private network over VPN. So if you're going to use VPN, then we would need to install this. Now we currently have no direction about what we're going to do with that from Hank. So we're going to go ahead and we're just going to leave NPS to be installed there. That'll be fine. And we'll tell it next. All right, now we need to do the IIS installation here as well. We'll tell it next. And for the time being, we're just going to leave the default selections as they are. Now I could take out some of this or add in additional, maybe some additional authentication options, FTP, all that good stuff. But since all we're using IIS for is to connect to the terminal server through Terminal Services Gateway, I'm just going to leave them as they are. We'll tell it next. And now, holy cow, here's all the stuff that we're going to do to the server. Wow, that's a whole lot of stuff, isn't it? Let's go ahead and click on Install. And now it's going to sit here and spin for actually quite a while, since we're installing so many different roles in order to use everything that we want to for terminal services. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while this thing is doing the installation. As soon as it reboots and comes back up, we'll take a look at what we have installed and we'll proceed from there. Alright, so here we are back on our terminal services. You'll see that everything has successfully installed here, and we do have a couple of information management elements. Manager processor and memory resources used by Windows. Let's go ahead and click on this guy here. Server Resource Manager. And this is just going to give us kind of a quick look at what Resource Manager actually is. It's kind of a cool tool. A little bit outside of the scope of what we're doing for this one, but a great way to basically watch what your terminal services server is actually doing, especially if you have a whole lot of users on it. Enable Windows Vista features on this terminal server with desktop experience. This is going to be important if a lot of users are going to be logging into the server. You want to give them just basically a better experience. Wouldn't recommend this if you are going to be using terminal services on low bandwidth connections though, okay? Alright, so just a couple of information notes, and that's good. We're going to click on Close. And by the way, it did take about 20 minutes for everything to get installed, just so you have an idea of what it might take. Alright, let's go into the roles section now, and as you see here, we have several new roles up and going. We have Network Policy and Access, Terminal Services, and of course our web server for our TS Gateway. So as you see, underneath Terminal Services, there's a whole lot of stuff in here that we're going to be taking a little closer look at on some of these elements in the next videos. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's wrap this one up. Now that we have that installed, I know there's a lot of stuff to be aware of when you go to install terminal services. So let's go ahead and call this one to a close, and let's go into more specifics in the next video. Alright, let's go back to the slides. Alright, so let's go ahead and let's go through some quick IT vocabulary, which is basically the stuff that we've just gone over, but I want to talk you through it again because there might be some new phrases to you, since a lot of the stuff is brand new with Server 2008. The Terminal Services role is the foundational role. It allows users to use applications that live on a TS server. TS Gateway is the TS role service that allows access to a server application over the internet without a need for a VPN. Although, just so you know, you still can use a VPN if you want to, you just don't necessarily have to. TS Remote App, which is pretty much required for everything else to work, just so you know, but it does come right along with the TS role. We've talked briefly about TS licensing, which is a role service for managing lots of TS licenses. Of course, we didn't get that one installed because we really don't know how it's going to work within our Globomantics network at this time. And then TS Session Broker, which is only for use if you're going to have multiple TS servers, okay? It allows reconnects to disconnected sessions. And then last but not least, TS Web Access, which is going to allow you to access TS remote apps via a web page. We'll see more about that in the next video. So after watching this video, you should be able to at least start to be able to describe the 6 components of terminal services, describe the differences between the 2 types of TS licenses, install the terminal services server role, select the appropriate role services during that role installation process, and then also use some help links after role installation to get a couple of little niceties installed along the way if you so desire. Alright, well that wraps up this video. Now that we know how to get this guy installed, let's go ahead and see if we can get a remote application up and running and use it with TS Web Access. Kind of a fun thing. I'll see you in the next video.